Hello and welcome to The Case For, a Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, attorney and baseball fan extraordinaire Russell Christian. Today is a very special episode for two reasons. First, it's the 40th episode of my podcast. Whether you've been a fan since today or day one, your support means the world to me. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to see it grow, please follow me wherever you download podcasts, as well as on my YouTube, Twitter, X, and TikTok accounts. If you're feeling chatty, leave me a review wherever you download podcasts. All of these cost you nothing and take less than a minute of your time and will tremendously help this podcast grow and prosper. More importantly, today is a very special episode because I am honored to welcome Rick Klein as my guest. Rick is the Vice President and Washington Bureau Chief for ABC News, and he's been a journalist for more than 25 years, both at ABC as well as the Dallas Morning News and the Boston Globe. Rick is the first guest on this podcast to have his own baseball card. He was featured on Top's 2016 Allen and Ginter set, and Rick is a fellow baseball fan extraordinaire and fellow diehard Dale Murphy fan. Recently, Rick was part of a movement called Murphy to the Hall, which is dedicated to raising awareness for Dale Murphy's Hall of Fame candidacy. Fans of the podcast know Dale Murphy was my very first episode, and indeed the very reason I started this podcast. So today's discussion is very near and dear to my heart. So without further ado, let's talk with Rick Klein about Dale Murphy. Rick, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
This is my favorite subject. I mean, we're covering wars and peace and everything in between in Washington, but this is my original passion, and to this day, my biggest passion.
You and me both. We have adversarial careers in two different ways. You're in media and the news. I'm an attorney. So to have something that brings everyone together in your life is always very nice.
Isn't that lovely? Yes, it's what a wonderful thing baseball can be, and Dale Murphy fandom in particular. Yeah,
for sure. And I guess that's a good point to start off with something. I'm sure you saw that Georgia Governor Brian Kemp recently had Dale Murphy Day. Did you see this in Georgia?
I did.
Yeah, February 20th.
Yeah. Very cool. Governor Kemp was involved, at least tangentially, in the campaign that we launched a few months ago that I know we're going to talk about to get Murph in the Hall. And he engaged on Twitter, as a couple of other governors do. As Governor Spencer Cox, Governor Ron DeSantis were also lobbying a little bit, and a former staffer of Kemp's was involved in the campaign. And Governor Kemp, I saw him meet Murph and fanboy out a little bit when he was there about, hey, I used to watching those games, all that. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you know more about politics than I do up there in D.C., but I thought it was interesting. The House resolution to name Dale Murphy Day is Georgia House Resolution 1417 had bipartisan sponsorship. Yeah. So maybe Dale Murphy is the thing that will heal this divided nation, so.
No doubt. He's certainly, baseball does that. And I think Murph in particular, his appeal, I think, transcends politics and party lines. That's something I learned in this campaign, if nothing else.
Absolutely. And I try not to talk politics and religion and stuff on my podcast, but it's interesting. I mean, you have to talk about that here, the House resolution, the bipartisan sponsorship. It's wonderful. And Brian is one of many people who are a part of this loose coalition, this fellowship, if you will, of trying to get Dale Murphy into the Hall of Fame. You're one of them. You talked about Murphy to the Hall. Let's talk about that a little bit. You were part of an initiative recently while Murph was on an era committee ballot to try to help Dale Murphy get in the Hall of Fame. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to say this started last summer, but it really started when I was about 9 years old. And I was,
you and me both.
Arguing about, was he better than Gary Carter or Mike Schmidt and my other friends? And I grew up in New York, but I was a big Braves fan because of TBS, and, loved Murph from the moment that I can remember loving baseball, which is basically my entire life. I was a Murphy guy and, collected his cards and, autograph, all of those things in between. And I got the opportunity as a grown-up to meet him. We met via Twitter originally. Someone had connected us probably 15 years ago when Twitter was pretty young. Yeah. And met there, and then connected in person a few times. We placed a friendly wager on an NFC championship game back in, I think, 2011, and the stakes were milkshakes. So he took me out for milkshakes in New York City. a couple months afterward, he met my dad. It was really a special moment, and we stayed in touch. And at that time, he had been, I think it was nearing the end of his time on the writer's ballot for the Hall, and not really getting traction. And I always assumed he would get in eventually. I thought at a certain point it would probably take the Veterans Committee to do it. But then, I watched from afar as a couple of Veterans Committees came and went, and he didn't really get a lot of traction. And then, fast forward to last summer, I went to Atlanta for one of these fan events that he and his wife helped put on, a Dale Murphy experience. And, I was vaguely aware of the way that the eras committees work and that they were coming up with the modern era that winter. But, conversation there with Nancy and Dale and some of the fans there that he was likely to be on that committee. And, it struck me that there had never really been, a concerted attempt to try to get him elected. There's a couple of guys over the years who've been the beneficiary of big team-driven campaigns. Kind of lobbying efforts. I think Tim Raines was helped by that. I think Andre Dawson at one point. I think Burt Blyleven, Harold Baines. Whether they were grassroots or AstroTurf type campaigns, which is a real term in my business, believe it or not. They existed, and people were aware of them going into the voting. And I knew the limitations. Ultimately, these are just a group of voters, 16 of them that get to make up their minds, whatever. But I certainly didn't want the moment to pass without really thinking through what could we do to boost Murphy's candidacy and his profile. And I talked to, I want to say I decided to report it out, basically. I probably talked to 80 something people in total that summer and into the fall to just try to make sense of what it would take. These are baseball writers, a couple of Hall of Famers, people that worked for teams, or had worked in conjunction with other. A lot of them are broadcasters. A lot of people that are just involved in the baseball world. It's not really my world, but I can leverage my connections with a couple of people here and there, and suddenly one person leads to 5 more, leads to 10 more.
Sure.
And I just started having these conversations, and where we landed ultimately was on what we hope to be a fan-driven campaign, just to raise awareness of Murphy and his greatness. And the main vehicle for this was the Murphy to the Hall website and a couple of videos that we did. And I worked with a really great political operative who I was connected with. I actually didn't really know him before, but he had done work for Kemp in the past. And he had the idea of trying to put together a video that we would post online and hope that it would take off. And he leveraged a connection or two to get the country singer Jason Aldean to voice.
Great. Yeah,
terrific. And Aldean, I don't know Jason Aldean. I know his music. I know that he's a Murphy fan, a guy around my age. Made sense. And he was kind enough to lend his voice to that. We worked with the ESPN writer, Wright Thompson, just one of the most, fantastic writers of his generation.
Great writer,
in my view, a true voice of the South, passionate. He helped write the script that Jason voiced for us. Yeah. And they put together a very professional looking video. And,
it was fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great. And the idea was we wanted that video to make a splash just so that people would be aware of this campaign and then start to share their own memories. A lot of people would send videos in talking about why they loved him, why they thought he belonged in the Hall, what their favorite Murphy memories were. And then, we got some organic engagement. Like I mentioned, we had 3 governors that tweeted about it. We also had Congressman Ro Khanna from California. There's your bipartisanship.
Exactly. Yeah.
Again, Ro Khanna, I think, born the same year as I was, and grew up in Philadelphia. Another, a fan from growing up. Spencer Cox from Utah. DeSantis growing up in the South, and kind of drew this cross section just in politics. Then we got, other folks. Mike Mills from REM, who had written a song years ago.
To the Veterans Committee, yes.
To the Veterans Committee of the Baseball Project.
Yeah.
He endorsed he said, use the song however you like. And it was a great buzzy, entree, because it literally is Dale Murphy to the Hall of Fame. That's the song.
You see the guitar behind me. I have a video of me on Twitter doing a poor rendition of that song.
I love it.
So yeah.
I love it. I love it. And just other people, Michael Kelly, who's from House of Cards.
Big Braves fan.
And big Braves fan. It turns out he grew up next door to the Murphys. and was friends with some of their kids. And Murphy, when he was at the height of his fame, would come out and play wiffle ball with him and his buddies in the neighborhood.
I didn't know that. That's
story.
I just figured it's because he's from Atlanta. I was like, that's all you have to say. Yeah.
Particularly the Murphy connection. He was his neighbor. So, those kind of connections, Killer Mike, the rapper.
Yeah.
Stopped by TMZ once and just suddenly talking about how Murph needed to get in the Hall of Fame. And we realized, okay, we reached exit velocity here. This is people are noticing this thing. It's really cool. I mean, to get that kind of cross section of celebrities and politicians and just, random people. And, it got to a point where we're talking up as much as possible just to get, to kind of get it in the baseball ether. And,
Sure.
we saw MLB Network. Brian Kenny did a couple of segments on it. Bob Costas weighed in, talking about what a great thing would be for baseball. And we got the buzz going. And we did another video with Ernie Johnson, who, of course, his father, as any Braves fan would remember, was the voice of the Braves and, former Milwaukee Braves player. And he's a legendary broadcaster. Ernie did a video with us as well. We got a video with one of Murph's kids and his family. We just, a lot of different kind of entrance points on this to try to build the buzz up to the voting in December.
Yeah, those videos were great. I love that they had the Tracy Ullman version of The Simpsons in the 1987 one. I'm like the old
part
school.
of the point, and I'll give credit to the to the guys that I worked with on this. That they wanted to place this in the 80s. They wanted people to remember where you were in 1982 or 1983 or 1987, and I, as I watched it, I saw the posters on the wall, and my mom actually texted me and said, "Did they shoot in your living room?" And I'm like, "No, that poster is everywhere. Like every kid had a Power Alley poster,
Oh, yeah.
Those were everywhere." But yeah, all those, E.T. and, Ronald Reagan, like if you're a child of the 80s, you associate those things a bit as much as you do with Dale Murphy and the powder blue jersey that's right behind you right now.
Yeah, of course. I saw Murph. He was on 680 The Fan Atlanta last week, and there's a couple things we can talk about there. But he used the phrase TBS kids, and I was like, oh, he's talking about us, So yeah, people who grew up in the 80s with Murph, it's great, and it's interesting because. Not to get too much into the stats, but you talk about equating Murph with the 80s. But when you look, I've gotten into this in my podcast episode about Dale Murphy. He's in the leaders for the 80s in hits, home runs, total bases. I believe he's second to Mike Schmidt in home runs in the 80s. I think he's the leader in hits and total bases. I believe Eddie
second
Murray.
RBIs behind Eddie Murray.
Exactly. Yeah, Eddie Murray's first. But he's right there on the leaderboards and all the major counting stats for that decade. So he's an iconic part of the 80s in baseball, not just in terms of the fandom, but in terms of the stats too. And not to get too much into my podcast, but I'm sort of like you. I grew up you're from up in New York. I'm from Atlanta. So but we're about the same age, same generation, grew up loving Dale Murphy. And then as you started to see he wasn't getting in the Hall of Fame, I was like, this is a travesty. He starts getting on the era committee ballots. And it was a few years ago, I thought, I enjoy the Hall of Fame discussion, but I really started my podcast because of Dale Murphy.
I know. I listened to it. One of the ways we connected is one of the things I was doing in doing research for the project that we would launch was to try to just find as many people who have weighed in on this publicly. And I stumbled across your podcast, listened to a bunch of episodes, including your Murphy one, and you talked about how biased you were on this question. It was
I'm not objective.
Podcast. You're a homer on it. But no, I mean, that's part of the point. And I can go in the stats with you all day long if you want. And if you extend the window from 1980 to 1990, Schmidt retired in 89. So he actually had more homers than anyone in that 11-year period. I think it was Governor DeSantis who said on Twitter at the time, how could you possibly have been a baseball fan in the 80s and not think that Dale Murphy was a Hall of Famer? It's a point that I think Bob Costas has made as well, that sometimes maybe we overthink the Hall of Fame discussion. Sure. Obviously Dale Murphy should be a Hall of Famer. Obviously he should be a Hall of Famer. And you can argue statistically about whether others belong or not. And there's the steroids era that came next, which I think really impacted the way he was perceived. But I felt strongly, again, since I was 8 or 9 years old, that this is the right thing. And in researching it, I came away more convinced. Truly, I tried to be as objective as possible with the stats and with comps, and I walked away thinking, he 100% belongs.
Absolutely. And it's, you mentioned the steroid era, and you have to mention this because the timing, he debuts on the ballot in 1999.
Yep.
And, right in the heart of the steroid era, because 98, you saw Bonds, Sosa and McGuire. 99, both in 98 and 99, McGuire and Sosa both had over 60 home runs. In 2000, Sosa had 50. 2001, of course, Bonds had 73, Sosa 64. So I've mentioned this in the pod. When Murph debuts on the Hall of Fame ballot, the baseball writers ballot,
Yep.
his 398 career home runs, his career high of 44 seems quaint. It
Yes.
doesn't have the same impact as these guys that are putting up the video game
Yeah.
numbers.
It's a critical point. I mean, the 398 homers, he retires in 1993 with that number, too short of 400. Could he have stuck around as a DH in the American League and got a couple more? Probably, but he went back. We got 8 kids, helped raise the kids. But when he retires, that was 26th on the all-time list, 398.
Exactly. Yeah.
Today, it's like 65th or something. And right, the timing between 93 and 98, you saw the numbers change. And you're right, all of a sudden they're putting up Nintendo numbers and things look different in the moment. And I think his stats did look different in even 98, 99, 2000 than they would have if he had been on the ballot in 1991 or 1992, just ahead of that era.
Yeah, and you mentioned how he retires in 93, so there's this, the mandatory 5-year waiting period. And a lot can happen in sports, and a lot of baseball writers have been at it a long time, but I see it now. There's generational divides. There's younger voters who focus more on the analytics and think it's a crime Barry Bonds is not in. That's a separate conversation. But I wonder how much, the institutional memory isn't necessarily quite there if you weren't a Braves fan or you didn't grow up with the Superstation. And when you're just looking at Dale Murphy's career compared to what's happening at that time, you're thinking, what's the big deal? You're like, no, understand. This guy was the big home run hitter of his generation with Mike Schmidt. I mean, that's
and leading the league with 36 or 37 home runs. I mean, guys have that at the All-Star break now. It looks a lot different in retrospect. But yes, in his time, for his era, there's no question that he was a dominant player. There's no question that he had Hall of Fame credentials. I mean, one of the things that I quote from in our material here was Bill James and his famous baseball abstracts. And I think it was from 1990, maybe even 89, but he did a thing where he did a one-word synopsis of the top X number of players, and he would talk just one word, and it's one word for Dale Murphy, Cooperstown.
Yeah.
If you lived through the 80s, this was at the end of the 80s that he's writing it. You believe that it was a no-brainer. It was no question. And you're right. Like he was up against, initially he was on the same ballot, I think, as Brett Yount and Nolan Ryan. Carlton Fisk wasn't even a first ballot Hall of Famer at that time. And there were just all these studs who were, kind of ahead of him in line. And I thought what would happen would be, he wouldn't get in the first year, but he'd keep getting that 15% to get to, at the time, I think he had to, or maybe it was 5% at the time. He had to keep growing on that a little bit. He never really got to that point, and never, by the time he was off the ballot, in the early 2010s, after 15 years, which was the time period then, you had just all these other guys who had come in and shredded the record books and changed what the numbers look like, and I think that just changed the way he was perceived by history.
Exactly. And it's funny. I call that era the recent home run extravaganza.
Yes.
When we want to get straight, we'll call it the steroid era. If I'm concerned about legal aspects, I call it the recent home run extravaganza. Either one works. It is what it is. It's commonly known as the steroid era. We don't have to necessarily imply anybody. I mean, some of the people I've just mentioned have already admitted to it. So we're not getting into legal hot water here. But it's interesting because Murph. Two things I want to talk about. You talk about how he was on some loaded ballots. I don't know if you've listened to my John Franco episode. He was, I believe, a one and done. He was on the ballot. I think there were 11 future Hall of Famers on the ballot with him. And I think that Franco, not to get off on a segue about John Franco, but I think he's got a really good Hall of Fame shot. He's in the top 5, I believe, all time. I think he's all-time saves leader for left-handers. But I looked at that ballot he was on, and I was like, if I only had 10 votes, he wouldn't be in that 10, because he was on the ballot with, all these all-timers. Yeah. So these loaded ballots probably hurt Murph. But even with the loaded ballots and the fact that he's debuting in the steroid era, he stays on the baseball writers ballot all 15 years, which I thought was impressive. Mm-hmm. And we've seen one-and-dones get into the Hall of Fame. Ted Simmons. We've seen... it's not uncommon for players that didn't last all 15 years to get in the Hall of Fame. So it's tough because I feel like, well, I wanted to ask you about this because you're in the world of media. You've been involved in every aspect of the media world. Have you had conversations, and you don't need to name any names or anything, but have you had conversations with sports writers to sort of get the idea of the mentality of baseball writers and how they vote. Is there
Yeah.
any insight you can glean into the process that might explain why he hasn't gotten the Hall of Fame on the baseball writers ballot?
Well, a couple things I've learned, and I've talked to a lot of writers. Some of whom told me they voted for him. Some of whom they said they didn't vote for him. Others of whom told me they're not going to reveal. But my general takeaways first. Other than service in the major leagues for 10 years or longer, and not being on the commissioner's banned list, there's nothing that defines a Hall of Famer in terms of stats or specificity, right? There's the character clause, which is in there, and the contributions, again, those are real, but it's up to anyone, any sports writer, or ultimately the people on the Eras Committee to decide what is a Hall of Famer, and it's up to you. And it is the kind of, it's the face test of, do I think of this? Numbers are big. No question, statistics are huge. And the statistics have changed, not just the way that the record book was changed, but the way we talk about baseball statistics. WAR was not a thing when Dale Murphy played. But you can go back and look at these things. And some of the defensive metrics, which I think have been unfairly unkind to him, overlooked the Gold Gloves. At the time, the Gold Glove was purely based on just what you looked at, and you thought the guy was an elite defender. So I think that that changed the way that some writers look at it, and that changed the way it's they considered a candidacy over time. I do think part of it was that they just didn't get momentum, and if you look, you studied this a lot more than I have, but guys get momentum on the writers' ballot, and even on the Eras Committee and the veterans ballots, they start to be the conversation. And that's what we tried to do this time, frankly, was to create a sense of momentum. I knew that we weren't going to penetrate that room. There were 16 men and women who were going to make this decision, and they can filter out anything they want. But what I wanted to do was to get in their heads about this, that this was something that's the right thing to do, that had support, that people could get behind and feel good about. There were a lot of people talking about, the potential for Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy getting it at the same time, which I thought American League, National League, just two good, solid guys. As a New Yorker, that would have been like beyond a dream.
For sure.
And it would have felt, I thought, like a great American moment on the 250th anniversary of the country to have those two men in Cooperstown this summer. That would have been a really special thing for fans across the country. Both guys that are from very popular franchises that weren't that good when they played. Neither of them won a World Series. I thought there would be a nice symmetry to that. But ultimately, I think the voters in the room weren't thinking like that. I think what I can understand, they looked at it and they thought, Jeff Kent, best power hitting offensive second baseman ever. And that was an easy one to have consensus around. Beyond that, I don't know how individuals voted. I do think that, your point about the way that the composition of the writers and the room changes, my hope moving forward, because he'll be on potentially in another 3 years and then maybe another 3 years after that, is that as more people serve on the Veterans Committee who saw him play, guys that are in their 40s and 50s and not their 70s and 80s. I saw Jeff Kent after he was inducted saying that he thought Murph belonged in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah, it's a great. So I think like when you have more of the Kent era, Frank Thomas, Derek Jeter era, if those guys are willing to serve on the committee, that you might have some momentum in the future, because guys, he was the favorite player of a whole swath of this country, guys that wore number 3 because they loved Dale Murphy, and a lot of them became major league players themselves, and some of them became Hall of Famers. So it's possible that just the mere makeup, but look, people make the decisions whatever they want. And I think especially for the players who vote, it's very hard for, I'm not going to be able to, not like I even tried here, but I didn't try to tell Jim Cott or Fergie Jenkins, what a Hall of Famer is or what it isn't, right? Like those guys, I didn't expect that you can convince them. I'm sure that I know that for a fact that some of the writers in the room were looking at our stuff. It was sent in. The Hall of Fame, Josh Rawitz, the president, makes clear if you send them something, they get it in front of the writers. And he was aware of our campaign and welcoming to, and solicitous to what we had. We had the Georgia State Hall of Fame, which Murphy's a member, put together a great glossy brochure that we put out there. So we were trying to hit this at a lot of different angles, but ultimately, the voters in the room don't even know how the other voters voted. They know the vote total, but they don't know for sure what who was on Team Murph and who wasn't.
Yeah, it's a bit of a smoke-filled room mystery to me. And I mentioned on the podcast, I think you can get a better idea of the players and or former players and managers, because a lot of them have come out and said, this player was good. To me, it was like the executives and the owners that were a wild card. No idea. A lot of them aren't on social media. They don't really talk publicly for various business, legal reasons. And so I'm like, I have no idea.
Same. I found that to be frustrating. I mean, I was, obviously we started this even before we knew who was on the ballot. We just presumed that Murphy would be on the ballot because he was one of the leading vote getters last time. But then when the ballot was released, it was like, all right, now our campaign goes into overdrive. Now who can we reach that knows Ozzie Smith or Robin Yount and yeah, with the executives, there really wasn't much I felt like that we could do usefully. And we want to be respectful to these guys too. Like it's hey, Rick Klein telling you that your favorite player should be in the Hall of Fame is not like a welcome piece of information for the most part. Yeah. So we tried to use stats and make that argument. The emotional argument that we did with the fans kind of stopped a week or two out, and then it became about the stats and the numbers and really drilling that in. Because I do think that's the thing that you can't change, and that no matter what else you say, I mean, I think Murphy in some ways has suffered over the years for being a good guy, because I think people have made an assumption that you need to lean on the fact that he was a great human being and is a great human being and a great humanitarian and giving and generous, all those things, to make up for the fact that he didn't have the numbers. And I just don't think that's the case. But I think the good guy image, in a way, like the character clause is there. It's been used to exclude people many, many times. But has it ever been used to include someone? I don't think it has. And I think it actually, in some ways, hurts the good guys because it feels like you're missing something.
Absolutely. And that's a common argument that always comes up with Dale Murphy fans and people that want to see him in the Hall of Fame. And I agree with you. You shouldn't use it as sort of a shoehorn to get someone that maybe doesn't have the stats. He's got the stats. Even if off the field, if he were a jerk, he's not. I would still say he belongs in the Hall of Fame for all the reasons of the stats and the hardware and stuff. And there's some players that you're like, okay, maybe he's not the nicest guy, but he's still a Hall of Famer. But Murph is a nice guy. And to your point, on this very ballot that he was just on, again, I don't want to name names again, but we talked about steroid era. There were some players there associated with steroid era. And we've seen players who have admitted who aren't in the Hall of Fame and have said, I mean, I'll say Mark McGwire had an interview and he's like, I've accepted the fact I'm not going to be in the Hall of Fame. And that takes, I applaud Mark for being honest. And so we've seen multiple players, and we all know who they are, not get in because of off-the-field issues. And there are other off-field issues, which I don't want to get into, but there's some players, even on some of the current ballots, that aren't really faring well because of some off-field issues. So, if you're going to keep someone out who is otherwise statistically, I believe, deserving, then how you should do the opposite. If this guy's statistically and deserving in terms of his hardware, put him in because he's a nice guy, because he is one of the ambassadors of the game. You mentioned Ozzie Smith, I think another one of the great ambassadors of the game. I'll tell a quick Murph story. So I've started my podcast about 3 years ago, and I was home in Atlanta last year to go see a Dodgers-Braves game, and I flew into Atlanta and saw on my Twitter X, Dale Murphy follows you, and I was like, no way. That was like
pretty cool, right?
Super cool, goosebumps moment. And then literally the next day, I'm at the Braves game with my brother and some friends, and we run into Dale Murphy, and he sees me and he's such a great guy. I didn't want to bother him. He comes out of his way, walks over and says hi to me and shakes my hand and says, hey, you just followed me on Twitter. I have my podcast. We start talking and and he said, hey, let's get a picture. I wasn't trying to bug him for a picture on that. But I said, Murph, man, I started talking about the case, and he's so humble. I said, you belong in the Hall of Fame, et cetera. He immediately changed the subject. He's like, well, what about Andrew Jones? I was like, okay, he doesn't want to talk about himself. He talked about Andrew. And I said, Andrew Jones, I don't take claim to this phrase. Other people said it. I said, he's Ozzie Smith with power. And Dale laughed. He said, yeah, Ozzie. And then he starts talking about Ozzie Smith. I was like, oh, yeah, these guys know each other, Ozzie and Dale. Two ambassadors of the game. How can you? And it's funny because Ozzie Smith, I don't want to get off on Ozzie Smith, but he's one of these players. Some people on the internet get into the advanced statistics, and I've heard a lot of, Ozzie Smith isn't a Hall of Famer discussions. His career batting average, I think, is like 256. He's got, I think, 2,600 hits. But he's a defensive wizard. He's got all these gold gloves. He's one of the greatest defensive shortstops of all time. So I don't put. I've said this before publicly. If you come out as there's two players that get a lot of and shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame, and for whatever reason, Lou Brock and Ozzie Smith. And if you come out as Lou Brock and Ozzie Smith should be in the Hall of Fame, I am not on your team. And I'm also on the. Tony Gwynn is overrated. If you come at me with Tony Gwynn is overrated, I will be angry.
No, I'm not gonna try to compete on that. And and I went into the campaign too. When Harold Baines was elected, I'm not gonna lie, I thought this Dale Murphy belongs over Harold Baines. Yeah. And a lot of people have speculated over the makeup of the committee that year. It happened to include Jerry Reinsdorf and Tony La Russa. And what happened with the different makeup of the committee, that's one of the sort of flaws in the process, is that you're stuck with whatever the committee happens to be in that particular year, right?
Yeah.
You're also stuck in the way that they pit other players against each other just by nature of who's chosen for the ballot. But yeah, I mean, to stay on your theme of just Dale Murphy being a great guy, I mean, the idea that this kid from New York who idolized him would be able to call him a friend as an adult. The first time I met him, I went for a handshake and he gave me a hug.
Yeah, that's
and
awesome.
I've seen the selfie thing that you said in public many times where someone comes up and they don't know what to say. And he's like, hey, you want to get a picture? And it just disarms them. And he really is that. And he's a good human. His family is magnificent. And I do think, at some level that he's wanted this. I think it means more though to his family overall and to his fans. He's got 8 kids, and he made the point that a bunch of those kids really didn't see him at the height of his fame. They were babies, they were young at the time, and so one of the things after the fact, his wife mentioned this, that really since he retired this past summer and fall, that was the first time that since he played, that they felt this massive fan outpouring, that he was part of the conversation again. And I think for a guy that's been out of the game for 30 something years, it was special to see that again. And even though we fell short, I felt like that was a success to demonstrate for him, to demonstrate for his family. Our love for him. It doesn't change my life that he's not in the Hall of Fame, but it kind of does. It's still meaningful to me in a way that it wouldn't obviously be meaningful, or it shouldn't be meaningful for individuals. But I invested a lot in him as a fan, and I feel like I got repaid many, many times over with him being who he is as a person, as a player, as you say, an ambassador for the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I was thinking the same thing as you, you're not in that smoke-filled room, but if you can make a dent, if people can sit down and say, hey, Dale Murphy, there's a lot of fans that want him in. I'm like, we've done our job.
That's right.
And you've got a little bit more of a clout than I do. I'm just a guy on a podcast. You're on the news.
That's right. I mean, I'm not. I'll say I went down to the winter meetings where the voting was happening. I emailed Major League Baseball, I was very honest, and said, look, I run the Washington Bureau for ABC News, but I actually want to go in a personal capacity because I'm part of this campaign to get Dale Murphy elected to the Hall. And they gave me a press credential and I could hang out. And, I talked to, the MLB guys, Harold Reynolds and Brian Kenny, coming and going on the set, just the way they weren't hearing anything we weren't hearing, but they knew of what we did. They were very aware of this campaign. Cool. And you're right. It would be mentioned a bunch of times, like, oh, he has a whole, slick ad campaign with Ernie Johnson and Jason Aldean involved in it. And you see this Killer Mike thing, and Chipper Jones was commenting on a podcast. Like, it got out there in a way that I think did, whether it made a dent, I don't know if we got him another vote. I cover politics my whole life. Like, at the end of the day, there's a scoreboard there, and you can measure this and say, okay, we didn't, he didn't get 12 votes, he didn't get in, he didn't get any more votes than last time even. But I do think I know it was meaningful for him. I know it was meaningful for me and for the people that I got to connect with through this project. And I think, for the baseball conversation, if people of another generation are talking about Dale Murphy in that conversation, that's appropriate as far as I'm concerned, because I'm not going to be in that room, but I can try to do what I can do to try to influence the conversation.
Yeah, and you said it exactly. The other generations, the generation that didn't grow up watching Murph, to whom his numbers are underwhelming, to whom the WAR isn't there. And before I forget, John Heyman has a great video out there on YouTube. I'm sure you've seen it, where he talks about sort of the retroactive application of defensive metrics, that now the analytic heads will say Murph wasn't a good fielder. I'm like, I'm not knocking the analytics, but I'm still a believer in the old-fashioned eyeball test. Go online. There's some excellent videos of Murph making some incredible plays, including the play, and I talked about it on the podcast, where he catches the ball, slices his finger, and continues to play through his consecutive games played streak and hits a home run off Dwight Gooden. I won't spoil it. It's a long story, but it's a great one. Go listen to my podcast episode if you haven't heard it already. But Murphy, all these things, the next generation that didn't grow up with this needs to hear. And I feel like, not to place too much self-importance, but that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the word out. And what I'm really focusing on is moving forward, because he will be on the ballot in 2028. I'm just amping up everything I've been doing for the past few years. What are you doing? What's the next few years look like for you?
Well, I learned a lot of lessons from this last campaign. And there's things I would do differently. There's things I do more of. There's things I do less of. I mean, and I don't know. We'll talk about it a lot in the next two plus years.
Yeah.
I don't think we would try the same thing all over again. I think, the fan campaign and that, I think had its limits. I would focus, I think, even more on the stats. I'd try to get more institutional players. I'd love to get the Atlanta Braves more involved as an organization to advocate.
Exactly.
I think that would be helpful. Maybe some current Hall of Famers who are comfortable speaking out in a bigger way. I feel like those are the voices. If you're a member of that committee, maybe you listen to another Hall of Famer or an organization like the Braves more than you do a fan campaign.
Yeah.
So that's a piece of it. But we'll see. We'll see. There's no guarantee that he's even on the ballot again. And who else is on there? That's one of the things that I'm concerned at looking forward is that they're going to skip the people that got 5 or fewer. So those steroids guys, the steroids connected guys, a couple of them are not going to be on the ballot at all. We know that. But Carlos Delgado got a lot of interest last time. Curt Schilling wasn't on the ballot last time, and it probably is due another turn in consideration. So it's other competition. I find a lot of flaws with what the Hall is doing right now in their system. I understand why they're doing it and staggering it. I don't love that you only talk about these guys once every 3 years.
Yeah.
That the executives and managers get considered as regularly as this whole swath of former players from 1980 on. And 1980 before, you have just as many eyeballs. I think they should do this more regularly. Put together some interesting matchups. And if you're gonna whittle it down to you got to vote for some number of these 8 people, have it considered more often, because you end up putting a lot on that one room in that one time. And that's the system. It's always, every system's going to be flawed. It's going to be what it is, and I can't change that. But I found this to be an enormously satisfying experience, as I said. It gave us some building blocks for next time. And, one of the great things about baseball is, there's always another game tomorrow, right? It's a long season. It's a long run. Murph is, I think, about to turn 70. He's a very healthy man, and I hope that he's on the ballot I hope he's on the ballot next time it gets in, and we have, he's around to enjoy it and enjoy many years of people talking about how much he has meant to them as a player and as a person.
Me too. I really wanted to talk about this, what we do moving forward. And as you said, there's no guarantee he'll even be on the ballot. He's eligible to be on there. But whoever is picking the names, we want to say loud and clear, it's time. He absolutely deserves. And I'll just say briefly, in the old days, they said that the counting stats matter because they didn't have Baseball Reference and some of the advanced stats and the internet. Now with Scott Rowland and Jeff Kent, we see these guys who don't have 3,000 hits, 500 home runs, some of these benchmark standards in the old days, but were elite players for 5 to 7 years. That's kind of the standard now. So I think if Murph were on the ballot now with today's standard, he's in maybe even first ballot.
I think like every generation is going to look at these things differently. I got to go to the Hall. I've been a bunch of times. I went a couple of months ago with a buddy of mine, and you take it in and you realize that the standards do change, and what's considered great over time changes, and that's okay. It's a living museum. It's supposed to be like that. Murphy deserves a spot there. There's no question in my mind. There's a lot of other men who are, who deserve it, or various degrees of that, and it's up for people to determine. I know what he meant to me and continues to mean to me. I know what he meant to thousands of other TBS kids. Kids who just connected with baseball from an early age. And, it's the people that have, had tough home lives and that was their outlet or things like that. I'm not that. I had a very happy childhood. I didn't need Dale Murphy to make me feel better about, my situation in life. But I loved watching him play, and I love learning about him and rooting for him. And I've gotten so much out of that over the years that I want to be able to give that back to him, give that back to fans, and hope that, people walk by a plaque for many centuries to come that they associate with what he meant to that era and to the game of baseball.
Exactly. And I hate to sort of cast it off as sort of the real Hall of Fame as the friends we made along the way sort of thing. I think he is eventually going to get in, and everything, that happens for a reason. And the fact that it's taken this long, if anything, if there's one positive, it's that everyone that had these experiences like you, like me, are all pushing for it. And I know that when it happens, it's just going to be so much fun. And I've already told my wife we're going to Cooperstown.
Oh, yeah,
we're going to book everything. We're going to have a big weekend.
Book it in advance. No, listen, I did a piece for Nightline on ABC that drew on some of this, but I got to meet Murph a couple of summers ago at the Field of Dreams, and that being itself a dream, and the way that baseball and it has this mythic presence in it. I totally agree, and it is what you get out of it, and the memories you share with people. And for me, a lot of them are involve good old number 3.
Sounds good. Well, looks like we're running out of time. So, Rick, I want to thank you. I'll have to have you back on as the years go on. So I'm going to pause the recording and we'll chat real quick. Thanks.
Thanks.
Rick, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss Dale Murphy's Hall of Fame case with me. We'll have to keep this conversation rolling as we build momentum for what I think will finally be Murph's year in 2028 for induction into Cooperstown in 2029. For more information on Murph's Hall of Fame case, check out murphytothehall.com. And to learn more about Dale Murphy and his foundation, go to dalemurphy.com and dalemurphyfoundation.org. Until next time, spring training is in full swing. The World Baseball Classic has already been a thriller with some huge home runs from Ohtani, Schwarber, and of course that walk-off home run from Ozzie Albies. So remember, when life gets you down, stop what you're doing and watch a baseball game.